Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Couric, and I think I speak for everyone when I say how alarming it is to see those statistics and to witness the dramatic rise of anti-Semitism in this country. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak with this distinguished panel today so that we can work to understand this extremely troubling moment in history and hopefully find a path forward. So joining me this morning, our second gentleman, Doug Emhoff. He is the first Jewish spouse of an American president or vice president. He has also worked as an attorney for over 30 years and is teaching law courses at the Georgetown University Law Center. Also joining us, Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall. She is the White House Homeland Security Advisor and has served in the role since the first day of the Biden administration. Previously, she was Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy in the Obama administration from 2014 to 2017. And finally, Eric Ward, who has spent more than 3 decades as a leader in the racial justice movement and is the Executive Vice President of Race Forward, which works to dismantle structural racism by building collective community power and transforming institutions. Thank you all so much for being here in Aspen. I wanted to start out by hearing from each of you individually about how anti-Semitism has affected you in terms of your personal lives and your work. I'll start with the second gentleman who has given me permission to call him Doug. Thank you.
Or Dougie. But only the vice president can do that.
You are, as I mentioned, the first Jewish person to be married to a U.S. president or vice president. I know that while you have highlighted and celebrated your faith in your role, something you saw in your hometown of Los Angeles shocked you so much that it propelled you to want to become the administration's most powerful voice against anti-Semitism. So let's talk about what you saw that day and how it made you feel. And we actually have a photograph of what you saw.
Yeah, so that is the 405 freeway. I see some fellow Angelinos here. So I live on the west side. So this is literally my hometown, my freeway, my neighborhood. And you can hear the anger in my voice. Just seeing it just re-triggers the fury that I felt when I saw that. I think it was really an accumulation of all the things that we had been seeing leading up to those flags unfurling and other things that had been happening around that time. But just take a quick step back. As you mentioned, I am the first Jewish person to be one of the 4 principals, which I knew being a man, the first man ever to be married to a president or vice president. We have a woman vice president for the first time. Thank you. So I came in thinking that was going to be a big deal, and it is. Being a man in this role has enabled me to speak out on so many important issues like gender equity, reproductive freedom, and all those things that men need to speak out on, and I've been doing that. But being a Jew in this role, again, I'm an entertainment lawyer from LA, so there's a lot of Jewish people where I'm from. And I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal. But once we did the first virtual Seder, kind of during COVID, tens of thousands of people saw that. We had the first menorah ever in the vice president's residence. We did the first Rosh Hashanah celebration in the White House. We did a live Seder at the residence. So I just decided, I'm going to just do whatever us Jews normally do, but we're going to do it at the White House. And you started to see the impact that was having. And even my dads, they live out in the desert. They're probably the only Democrats out there. But even my dad's 85-year-old Jewish friends would come up to me and say, "We didn't vote for you." But I started crying when I saw the Seder and the mezuzah. So it was having an impact. I did start to speak out about anti-Semitism, even in those early days. But I went to Europe, and I met with Eric Rothschild, who told me, he said, "Look, there is an epidemic of hate going on in this world right now. you're the first, you have this big microphone, you better get back there and start speaking up. And that was around the time Deborah Lipstadt was coming in as a special envoy for anti-Semitism, and we started to kind of put the pieces in place. But when I saw that flag, I needed to turn the anger into action. And that led to, I think some of you were there or saw, we had a big convening at the White House. Susan Rice, who's not here, but has done a great job on this. We convened a very big group. I see some folks who were there. And we got to work. A few days after that meeting, the president lifted up an interagency, all-of-government task force to come up with what we came up with, a plan, a national plan to combat anti-Semitism. And I knew we had to do more. I went to the UN and spoke. I went to Auschwitz, which was just, I'm still processing the emotion of that trip. And found out parts of my family were killed in the Holocaust when I was there, and just going home and talking to my father about that, just so emotional, so searing. So it's all these things led up to me doing this. I will give just a kudos to my wife, the vice president, because before that big convening at the White House, I knew that was going to be a big deal. It was a big moment for me and for us. And she could see I was a little tense. And she said, look, you're going to be sitting at that table for the millions of people who aren't here and the millions of people who will never be at that table. And you got to speak for them. You got to channel that rage. You got to channel their voices, and you got to step up. You're the first you in this role. You have to take responsibility. And I've really tried to do that and honor that.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Liz, and may I call you Liz?
Please.
Okay, good. Your great-grandparents fled oppression in Eastern Europe, and you have spoken about your family's experiences with anti-Semitism. Can you share a little bit about your personal history with us?
Yes, thanks. First of all, so many friends in the audience. It's such an honor and privilege to be here with you today. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. My family did come in the late 1800s, escaping pogroms from what is now Ukraine and Lithuania, to the United States, seeking a place in which they could practice their faith without fear. And slowly they came across the country to the West Coast, looking for a more open community that would welcome those who were different, and they made a life in Los Angeles also. My father's experience and my mother's experience with anti-Semitism were real, although very different from what we're talking about here today. There was discrimination. My mother was taunted and chased home from school in Omaha when she was a little girl because she was Jewish.
My mom grew up in Omaha, too.
I didn't know that.
How about that? And she's Jewish, too.
She may have had, I've read about what you said about your mother, she may have had similar experiences. They came west.
Yeah.
To a place that they hoped would be more tolerant. And they found that, and they built a life there in which my father's way of processing what he experienced in terms of discrimination was to build bridges to the Black community and the Asian community, to those who were also experiencing discrimination and some oppression. And he chose to use his life in that way to create the unity that we need today in standing down this hate. We can't do it alone as Jews. We have to do it together with all of those who are experiencing this rise in hatred. And what is different today is that the hate is becoming violent. It's being normalized. It's moving from the extremes to the mainstream. And there are people who believe it's appropriate to use violence to achieve their ends, to wipe people out. And we've seen it. You showed the film of the synagogue in Pittsburgh. There are so many examples, including very recent examples in Los Angeles of synagogue goers being targeted and shot coming out of synagogue, and many other cases. So what I have done in my lifetime is to try to find a way to serve and to build bridges and to strengthen and heal our country. And that's what we'll talk about here today.
You mentioned joining forces, and that's a perfect segue to Eric. Eric, you've been studying the intersection of anti-Semitism and white nationalism for decades. Talk to us and explain how these two movements or two things are really related.
Absolutely. So it starts with me in the punk clubs of Los Angeles in the 1980s, and we found our music subculture under attack by individuals who were calling themselves neo-Nazi skinheads. And we loved our music scene. And we spent the next 10 years trying to organize to prevent this type of violence and intimidation. Katie, we started to collect flyers, right, of these hate groups. It's pre-internet, I'm that old, right? And we noticed on the flyers, they're vilely racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, you name it, it was in these flyers. But there was always some symbol, like a Star of David or a reference to the Zionist occupational government, ZOG, or caricatures of Jews. The truth is that I came to understand anti-Semitism like many of my friends because we were trying to understand what was motivating these groups to carry out this act of violence in our subculture. The truth is at the core of much of hate group organizing in this country is the idea of Jews being part of an international conspiracy, right, to control and destroy the white race. It is the basis for the Great Replacement theory and QAnon. The truth is I came to take anti-Semitism seriously because I understood that it wasn't just impacting the Jewish community, that all of us were actually becoming victims to anti-Semitism, whether we're talking about the mass shooting of Latinos in an El Paso Walmart, the Tree of Life synagogue, the Buffalo supermarket shooting of African Americans, Charleston, the Gilroy Garlic Festival. At the end of the day, all of these mass shooters attacked communities of color because they believed that we were merely puppets of this Jewish conspiracy. And anti-Semitism is a threat to all of us. And as we began to understand it and look at it, at the end of the day, we also understood it was a form of racism. It placed Jews not as a religious other, but as a racial other or something different than human. And we understood as racial justice activists that we should oppose all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism.
You know, I know that what happened in Charlottesville. Yeah, please. I know what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, a few years back had a huge impact on the country, on me personally, on President Biden, on everyone probably in this room. I was there on the ground during the so-called Unite the Right riots. I was doing a documentary about Confederate statues and iconography and a Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, which had become extremely controversial. Let's take a look at this clip to bring people back to that time.
The Unite the Right marchers were on the university grounds. They made their way toward a statue of Thomas Jefferson in front of the rotunda as a group of students waited.
You see, the raising of the Confederate monuments is exposing once again this nation's racist roots. And they come with the same weapons that have been used for generations.
Jews will not replace us! You will not replace us!
And now just across the road is hundreds of alt-right people carrying torches. Can you see that was really heartbreaking for me because I went to the University of Virginia, and to see those people march down the lawn chanting that, and then the next day was even more terrifying But I know that President Biden, Doug, has said that seeing those neo-Nazis march in Charlottesville was originally what spurred him to run as a rebuke of the bigotry and extremism that had flourished under former President Donald Trump. And I'm curious what President Biden has told you about how he was affected by that night and the next day.
So, thank you for that, Dan. It's just so shocking again to see that, isn't it? And I'm just sitting here, just again in a fury watching that. As was then retired Joe Biden. Remember, he was,
right.
You know, just doing his thing. And when he saw that, we have talked about it. We talked about it on the campaign. We've talked about it repeatedly, many times. How much that impacted him and appalled him, and just this fight for the soul of our nation, which is what he talked about during the 2020 campaign, and which we are still going to be need to be talking about.
And by the way, Doug, what President Trump said the next day.
I will get to that. Which just look. Let's just be clear. There's only one side. You have to be against anti-Semitism. Period. There's no two sides to this issue. And true leaders know that. True leaders like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris know that. There's only one side. You have to be against hate, and you have to all stand together, as Eric was saying. I do want to share one other just amazing story with the president. So when I was on my way to Europe to go to Auschwitz and to meet with the special envoys in Berlin, he pulled me aside into the Oval Office. And I said, okay, am I in trouble? I think everything's going okay. And he just wanted to talk to me more beyond Charlottesville about his own father. His own father would always talk to him as a young man, a young child, about the evils of anti-Semitism, about how Biden Sr. was always so upset that we as a government back then didn't do more with the information that we had, didn't drop bombs on the train tracks and do other things. And he, put in President Biden's brain as a young man how evil this was. And he shared that with me. And he shared with me how he and his family have all been to Dachau to make sure that they saw it with their own eyes. So he just wanted me to know, as I was going on this trip, it wasn't just because of Charlottesville. This goes back to when he was a young man from his own father, so a lifetime of having this belief that this is evil, this is wrong, the Holocaust happened, we've got to tell the truth about it, and we've got to make sure leaders are leading this fight against hate and anti-Semitism. So it was just one of those, when people ask, what's it like being second gentleman? I said, well, just being able to have moments like that with a leader like that is truly remarkable.
Let's kind of unpack what's happening now and why we're seeing such a tremendous rise. According to the ADL, anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. surged 36% in 2022, reaching the highest level recorded since 1979. So, Doug, let me start with you, and I'll go down the line. What is going on?
So the numbers, and I see Jonathan Greenblatt here, the numbers are probably worse than what's been reported, because I don't think as good a job as we're all trying to do on reporting incidents of anti-Semitism. It's just we're being overwhelmed by it. Just literally, as we speak, look what happened in Georgia, where people are literally bringing Nazi flags in front of temples. This stuff is lawyers in my hometown, which I was a big firm lawyer for 30 years, and you just could feel it. And I remember anti-Semitic language being used in front of me if people just didn't know I was Jewish. And then to see what was happening with those emails behind the scenes, it's enraging. All this stuff, this is a steady drumbeat. So the numbers are high. But we can't normalize it. And one of the pillars of the plan is making sure we just don't get numb to this steady drumbeat of this day to day, because it doesn't rise to the level of Tree of Life or Charlottesville. But these are very, very bad things that are happening that we just can't ignore. Because if we just ignore it, it just gets calcified, it just gets into the system, and it just gets harder and harder and harder to push back on it. So we've got to stand strong on each and every one of these things that happens almost on a daily basis, and that is one of the pillars of this plan. We've got to push back on this normalization.
But Eric, let me turn to you. I mean, why now? Can you describe the factors that exist in our culture and society at large that accounts for a 36% increase, the highest level since 1979? What do you see happening?
There are a few factors that have come into play. The first is changing demographics in the United States. There is something called anxiety, social anxiety. Many of us have it. I certainly had it when I walked into the room with both of you today. And what we know, though, right, is we get over anxiety by continuing to put ourselves right into that space. You get over the fear of flying, not by not flying, but by flying more. And it's the same with demographic change in America. However, political movements have sought to tap into that anxiety and to argue with us that it's an existential threat, that it's not something natural, but something we should be afraid of. And they've used that to run electoral politics in this country by demonizing immigrants, demonizing trans community, demonizing Jews. But it's not just demographic anxiety. It's also income inequality in this country. And it's the permanence of segregation, right, that prevents individuals and communities from actually engaging with one another. These are some of the factors. But the truth is that the real factor to the rise of anti-Semitism in this country is the victory of the 1960s civil rights movement. Imagine that you are an arch segregationist who's been raised all of your life to see black people as inferior in every way. You don't have to think about it. It's the air you breathe. And you wake up one morning and you find that you've lost your biggest political fight, right, to folks you've seen as inferior. How do you change that? Do you all of a sudden say, well, I guess black people aren't inferior? That's not what happened. They came up with a reason, and they borrowed from something in Europe in the early 1900s called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was a false anti-Semitic story, right, that purported that Jews were seeking to take control of the world. For arch segregationists, by buying into this anti-Semitic line, it allowed them to keep in place the idea that black people were inferior, that we were just puppets of our Jewish masters. Anti-Semitism fulfills for white nationalists and others in the society easy answers to global and demographic change.
And it's interesting, I know that in Ken Burns' recent documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, he talks about how Hitler actually learned a lot of his treatment of Jewish people from the treatment in the U.S. toward black Americans, which I think is interesting. Liz, you wanted to add to that?
What you've described, which is so powerful. There are some other factors. We have to call out leaders who don't condemn anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. And that has changed our country. We have political leaders, we have celebrities, we have sports figures, and that gives permission to people to think that it's all right because these are people they admire and who have some power. And that's of enormous consequence. So a big piece of our job is to speak out and call on everyone who plays a leadership role in our society, all of you, to take action to call out the normalization of violence against Jews and others who are experiencing these targeted attacks, very deliberately targeted attacks. Second, one element that has amplified and spread the bile of hatred, anti-Semitic hatred and other hatreds, is the fact that people live online. And we can't deny it. It's a reality of our culture, global culture today. What we know is that people are informed of the views that you described. They are mobilized by what is online, The algorithms online drive people into darker and darker places.
And they're connected, Liz, right?
They're connected, and over again, we find in the aftermath of a shooting, a mass shooting, young people, particularly men, who have been incited to violence online. And so that is another area of work for us to call on social media companies, the platforms that have such power, to own the responsibility for what they are proliferating on their platforms.
You also, you know, anti-Semitism is sometimes described as a canary in the coal mine for hate generally. And the growth of anti-Semitism globally is a sign that other forms of hatred are in fact becoming more widespread. Correct, Liz?
Absolutely. And this is a global trend. We have seen this happening in many of the democracies that we work most closely with around the world, experiencing similar challenges with respect to the proliferation of hate, violent attacks. So again, coming from the fringes into the mainstream, having access to guns, being incentivized online, incited online, and then taking action. We in this country know that we lead the world as the world's shining light of democracy, and this phenomenon puts our democracy at risk. We cannot have a healthy democracy if we have this degree of hate and violence taking place in our society. So the reason the president is so motivated about this, and the vice president, is this would spell the end of our democracy as we know it if we don't get this under control, if we don't stand up, if we don't together fight the normalization of violence and the fact that, as Jonathan Greenblatt's data show, we are now in a situation in which it is on the rise. And so we have developed the strategy at the president's direction. Susan Rice and I led this effort to build a whole of government approach and also a whole of society approach.
I'm going to get into the strategy in just a moment, but I wanted to ask, turn to Doug, because increasing awareness of both anti-Semitism and Jewish American heritage, I know, is one of the plan's key pillars. And I always feel like ignorance is often behind all of this hatred worldwide. So this is so crucial when you consider that, according to the ADL, this shocked me, 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Semitic trope. That wasn't as shocking as a 2020 study that showed more than 3 in 5 millennials and Gen Z people, whatever you call them, didn't know that, no, but this is actually really upsetting, didn't know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. 3 in 5 millennials and Gen Zs. And I'm curious, Doug, I mean, how do we begin to course correct in terms of educating the public about Jewish history, particularly during a time when unvarnished history, the real history of our country, is facing such pushback?
Yeah, so we need to, one, tell the truth. Leaders need to tell the truth about the Holocaust and what happened. And again, I go back to my visit to Auschwitz. If you've been there, like me, you'll never forget it. So I say, if you could see what I saw, the shoes and the hair and the glasses and the
suitcases
and the suitcases, but also the starkness, the coldness. You can feel the evil, and you could see it.
And the photos.
And again, the barbed wire and the lone, just the architect. It's just horrible just to think about it. We've got to get that out there. You know, everyone can't go, but we need to make sure that we're going to get that experience out to people. We also need to make sure we're telling the stories of Holocaust survivors. There are not many left. Soon there won't be any left. And there are some great programs at USC and others where we're using technology, AI, holograms, to make sure that you can still experience the stories of these survivors, which are so important. And just education. A big pillar of the plan is actual funding for schools, for education, where it's actually being taught. But we need help. As a federal government, we can't do everything. So that's why we've been, part of the plan is reaching out to state governments, local governments. I just met with mayors, which I think we'll talk about, to get them on board, to making sure that this curriculum is actually being taught, because as you said, the numbers are stunning of people who just do not know about it. Then they're more apt and prone to disinformation and misinformation, which leads to all the other things that we've been talking about.
An
Liz,
example
yeah.
for all of you on this is that we are funding the first ever Holocaust Education Research Center at the U.S. Holocaust Museum to provide the curriculum and content for schools across the country to get after what you're talking about, that people actually don't know. Young people are not being educated to know the history. And of course, if you're a Jew, you know, if we don't learn the lessons of history, it will be repeated. We're fierce about this. And so this is something that we have to continue to do. And it's an initiative that we've undertaken as part of the new strategy.
Can you outline some of the other pillars
Of course.
the U.S. national strategy to counter
I would
anti-Semitism?
love to do that. So Doug has already, of course, described a number of the elements. The first is to increase understanding of and awareness of anti-Semitism and of Jewish heritage in this country. So that really is about people knowing what it means. What is anti-Semitism? How does it manifest itself? In what ways do you need to detect it and not allow it to be normalized? The next, which is very important to Jewish communities across this country, the second pillar of the strategy is what do we do to ensure that our Jewish communities feel safe and secure in their homes, in their schools, in their places of worship, in their supermarkets. That is a big responsibility, of course, for all of us. And one of the things that we have been able to do through federal funding is support training for Jewish communities, in particular, for example, for Jewish schools, for Jewish places of worship. If you know what happened in Colleyville, if you've listened to what Rabbi Citron Walker said after he and his congregation were taken hostage, they survived because of that training. And we have asked Congress to actually double the amount of funding we had at the beginning of this administration to support an expansion of that training so that we can help Jewish communities prepare themselves for what they may experience. Now, that's not sufficient. So the third pillar of the strategy is about what we're doing to prevent the normalization of violence, that is, normalization of anti-Semitism and violence against Jews. And that relies on our law enforcement community. And so there is an enormous effort underway to improve the way in which we share information in real time across communities, gather it and get it out so that it is known to law enforcement wherever they are that something may be happening and they get in and apprehend it before a disaster happens. And we have created at the Department of Justice the first ever Center for looking at domestic terrorism, including anti-Semitism, to ensure that the Department of Justice is taking action where it can to investigate and prosecute crimes against Jews as federal hate crimes. And you'll have seen in that Los Angeles, the two shootings that I mentioned that took place in February, within days, there was a federal indictment of the individual who shot at those two people who had just emerged from their places of worship. So the work of law enforcement is intensified, elevated, and focused in the strategy, and we'll continue that work as long into the future as it needs to be sustained. And finally, it's the piece I mentioned at the beginning, and which Eric also described so powerfully, is the work we have to do to build allies across the communities that are targeted by those who hate. I'll draw from another area of my work, which is on the relationship between the United States and our allies in Europe, which you will have been reading about a lot, given the war that Russia has mounted against Ukraine. In the NATO alliance, there is a phrase, an attack on one is an attack on all. That is the solemn pledge that is made when you join NATO. We have to have that same view. An attack on one, any hatred that is violent, we have to stand against it, because that is who we are as a nation. It's why people came to this country. Initially, many of our ancestors came for that freedom of speech, assembly, practice of their religion. Anybody who is being targeted for their faith or ethnicity or gender, we need to stand up for them. And that is how we will fight this.
I fear that sometimes that's easier said than done in terms of getting allies to join forces. And Eric, because anti-Semitism and white nationalism are so inextricably linked, how can we get everyone on the same team? How can we make sure a strategy like this isn't preaching to the choir? And you know, and you mentioned demographic changes. I just wanted to illuminate that by 2044, white Americans will be in the minority. So we're seeing this creep up, and as a front to some of the forces that you were describing earlier. But how can we get people to join forces?
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. The first is we have to admit that anti-Semitism exists. You know, in now I can't even remember, 2017, about 6 months before Charlottesville, I authored an essay called Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism. And it was my labor of love. It was my warning to this country about what was coming. And I think since that time, there are 3 important lessons about how we move forward together. The first is we have to acknowledge that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and one will not end anti-Semitism in this country without effectively challenging racism. And we will not effectively challenge racism without understanding the narrative of anti-Semitism and how it drives this moment. All of us understand stories are incredibly important, and they can be incredibly toxic as well. And anti-Semitism is also a conspiracy theory. So we have to be willing first to understand anti-Semitism. The second is this. We have to understand at the end of the day, anti-Semitism is a new conversation in this country. We have had conversations around Holocaust education, and even that's more recent than people believe. But the conversation around anti-Semitism is very new, and we have to give ourselves space to build muscle around this conversation. And building muscle around this conversation means that many of us, right, the good people, are going to make mistakes, and we cannot eat each other up when we make our stumbles as we are practicing this. So in the second piece, if it's about understanding anti-Semitism is a form of racism and oppose all racism, the second is a commitment to stay in the room together, particularly in those moments where we most disagree. Third, because this piece I think is really crucial, right? The third piece is to understand how anti-Semitism functions. You have to understand anti-Semitism. One of the roles is to create a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in a society, so that when the have-nots become frustrated, they're allowed to take their frustrations out on that buffer, the Jewish community. At the end of the day, the people we have to reach around this conversation around anti-Semitism aren't the kids in the student council, right? Aren't just the folks in Congress. It's the guys out riding bikes. It's the folks out quilting. It's the folks gardening. It's the folks smoking in the alley. These are the individuals in our society, right, who are most vulnerable to this anti-Semitic conspiracy. So we have to move out of our own bubbles and be committed to re-engaging the American public as they exist in this moment to make movement on this issue.
I add one. I resonate with that so powerfully because I think when you feel threatened, you have a tendency to want to hunker down with those who are like you. And that would be the opposite of what we need to do, which is to actually stand together. It's uncomfortable. It can be hard. We are fractious within the Jewish community. There are issues between us and other communities, but we have to stand together to protect and strengthen our democracy. That is what is at stake.
That's right.
And to get out of your bubble, and as Brian Stevenson often talks about, to be proximate, because there is so much de facto segregation in our culture right now. Doug, you mentioned earlier that you met with bipartisan mayors at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And I'm curious what came out of those meetings. Do they recognize how serious a problem this is, even though you can't, they're not a monolith, but what were you hearing from them?
Right after we put the plan out, I think the first thing that I did post-plan was to meet with the mayors. There was a conference of mayors every year in Columbus, Ohio. And this was a group of bipartisan mayors, Jewish, non-Jewish, black, white, Latino. It was a great mix, and Eric, you would be very happy to see this mix. And these mayors volunteered to meet with me and be part of a group of mayors committed to pushing back on hate and anti-Semitism, because they're mayors. They know what is happening in their communities more than any of us. And as we've been talking about, as Liz was talking about, this hate affects what is happening in their communities. It affects the safety of their communities. It affects the economy. It affects how policing is done. It affects how school is being taught. It affects, how buildings can get built. So it was an incredible, wide-ranging discussion. We heard some instances, there was a couple of Jewish mayors there, or mayors that had supported Jewish Heritage Month last month, and then they got these, those horrible little flyers in the bag with the rocks, which I had seen in my own neighborhood in LA. So they had those. There were demonstrations and things like that, just for recognizing this issue. So work to be done. But we had some very discrete takeaways that we're going to keep in touch with. A lot of it was on the security issue, because most of all, communities want to feel safe. It was on training their police forces. Some of these communities have no Jews, or just very few. They don't even have a synagogue. But these mayors are still committed to this issue. And we talked a lot about compassion. And one of the ways to fight back on anti-Semitism, and we talked a little bit about the education piece, is let's lean into who we are as Jews. Because it's a joyful, I love being Jewish. I love the culture, I love the food, I love everything about it. So we got to get that counter programming out there too. Get that compassion, get that joy, get that love out there. And that's how we kind of left that meeting on a really high note, which I like to leave every meeting on a high note.
Did they embrace this notion of giving, of the educational component, which is so important because we're talking about young people and future leaders and future citizens?
Mayors are very bottom line. And when you're a mayor, especially in a smaller, mid-sized community, you'll be at the supermarket and somebody is tugging on your jacket to talk about things. So they know that the more that they can do on effectuating this plan in terms of the education piece, the security piece, the counter programming, and demystifying who Jews are, what we are, it's just going to make their communities safer, make their jobs easier, because as we've been saying, this hate, it's corrosive. It affects every part of their communities, and as mayors, they know that, and they want to push back on it.
Eric, I want to touch on allyship just one last time. I read a lot of what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar writes, and he has talked often about the intersectionality between blacks and Jews in this country that people don't really think about that much. And he wrote recently on about a spate of troubling comments and actions by well-known figures and the repercussions he believes it will have on the future of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's interesting because he's speaking specifically about those who aren't calling out anti-Semitism. He says, why is it so hard for some people to learn no one is free until everyone is free? As Martin Luther King Jr. explained, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. So let's act like it. If we're going to be outraged by injustice, let's be outraged by injustice against anyone. Eric, I'm curious, does it frustrate you to see marginalized groups do the same things to other marginalized groups without perhaps realizing the insidious impact of those actions?
It does. It also frightens me in this political moment. We saw on January 6th that democracy came under significant siege. It rocked this country. It also put at risk over 70 years of civil rights struggle. Right? My grandparents and those before them struggled very hard and risked much to bring this country to this very point in time where we are able to move forward together. But it is true that bias exists in our society and none of us are immune to it. I actually think it's sad, but it's also an opportunity to realize that as we are moving into a multiracial nation, it is important for all of our communities to dispense with the idea that we too don't carry bias. And as real leaders of building this inclusive multiracial democracy, we have to triple and quadruple down to make sure that we don't bring forward this type of bias. At the end of the day, Katie, it's almost a spiritual sense that we have to decide that we are moving from this idea of scarcity, right, to a society of abundance. One where all of us can live, love, worship, and work free from fear and bigotry. It is not that far outside the realm of possibility. Anti-Semitism creates a counter-narrative to that inclusive democracy. And that's why each of us should take it seriously. It has an impact on our communities. If you're an immigrant, if you're trans, if you're black, anti-Semitism impacts your community. And if we're real leaders in our community, we invest in understanding the challenges. And I'll just say this last thing. I used to play a kid. I grew up in LA. I'm the third of 5 generations of Los Angeles. And I grew up poor. And we used to play this game called If I Were, right? And we sit in a circle. If I were in a lion's cage and a lion got out, here's what I would do, right? We'd argue. But the question that always came up was, if I were in the midst of the 1960 civil rights movement, here's what I would do. And we would argue about what we would or wouldn't do. We didn't understand the choiceless choices of our parents. We were full of bravado. That question has always haunted me, and it should haunt everyone in here. What would you have done? And I'm here to say, you no longer have to wonder what you would have done. The truth is we are in a moment in our country's history that whatever it is you do when you walk out this door today is what you would have done in the 1960s. Make your actions count.
And that was beautiful. And, you know, Doug, I'm sure when you were in Auschwitz, I was recently in Amsterdam and I went to the Jewish Museum and I did an event for a Holocaust museum in Cincinnati. And I have to say, Eric, I couldn't stop thinking, what would I have done when we were celebrating the brave people who, you know, who housed a relative of mine in Holland for 3 years in spite of great danger to him and his family. And I'm sure, Doug, you must have thought about that when you went to Auschwitz.
I'll tell a quick story. The last day of this emotional, wrenching trip through Europe, the last meeting I had were with a group of Holocaust survivors in Berlin. And the last person I talked to told this story, which was basically she was in her 80s, and she was saved from certain death by a kindly German soldier who took pity and, you know, hit her, and she was able to escape and spend her life in Ukraine. And now she's back once again as a refugee in Berlin. So this stuff is real. And I will never forget just that meeting and that story. And just always talk about that and carry it with me, because it just shows how connected this is and how fragile this is. But I know we're running low on time, so the last thing I just want to say, and Eric kind of mentioned that, is I have Jewish people come up to me all the time just to thank me, thank our administration for what we're doing, just for talking about this. And having a plan, and having the Jewish people in roles of leadership just leaning into this. And I know my father all the time says, be careful. These, you know, there's a lot of dangerous people out there. Be careful. You are putting yourself at risk. I said, I don't care. I'm going to keep doing it because, you know, this is the time to do it, as Eric said. And so we got to keep speaking out. Leaders got to keep leading, call out those who don't. And we just have to, again, just, you know, chest out, chin up, and be proud of being Jewish.
And Liz,
openly, proudly, and without fear.
Sorry to interrupt. And Liz, I'll let you have the last word because we are out of time, but this has been such an important and fascinating conversation. Thank you all for being here. But Doug said he likes to end meetings on a high note, and I like to end interviews on an actionable item for everybody in this room, because I think sometimes we talk about these problems theoretically, but what could each and every person do that would have an impact in their communities or in communities perhaps outside their own?
Thank you, Katie, for giving me that opportunity to close. What we have all said here clearly is silence is complicity. And each of us in our own lives, in our professional lives and in our personal lives, in our extracurricular, volunteer, philanthropic activities, needs to use our voice to do exactly what we've talked about here today. And if you have the time, and we'll go online and find our strategy, it has 100 action items. Many of them are for civil society. There's a lot the federal government should do. We call on the Congress to do a bunch of things, but actually the most power lies in your hands. CEOs have responsibilities. I mentioned the leaders of the tech community, those in the sports world, celebrities, civil society organizations, schools and colleges. We have so many specific actions that need to be taken, and I encourage you each, if you're motivated by this conversation, to look at the strategy and take something from it and implement it, because together it is the only way we can move forward to heal our country and save our democracy.
Well, again, thank you all so much. Second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, White House Homeland Security Advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall, and Eric Ward, Executive Vice President of Race Forward. Thank you all so much.